Hello, this is French Weird. Welcome back. I hope you're well. My name is Russell Williams. French Weird has been launched to the world. It is being listened to all around the globe and possibly in other dimensions as well. You are not alone. Today we're going to get deep into the world of a French weird writer who might be new to you. We're going to be thinking about George Langelaan. He's had a hell of a life. He was a war hero, a spy, underwent radical surgery, encountered Alistair Crowley, no less, in Paris. He was also a short story writer, responsible for a story called La Mouche, The Fly, that was filmed, of course, by David Cronenberg. We're going to get to grips with all of this. We're going to think about the myth of Langelaan. We're going to think about some of his other short stories. At the end, we're going to round up with some of the feedback that French Weird has been having so far in our brief yet rich life. Don't forget, you can get in touch with me at frenchweird.com or via russell@frenchweird.com. Let's get going. Speak to you later. There's a lot to say about George Langelaan. He was born in 1908, passed away in 1972. That we know for sure. Biography with Langelaan is tricky, so I've tried to pull together what I can in the best way that I can. We know he was Franco-British. We know he had a dual nationality, a dual identity. That's something that I'm really interested in. He had a French mother. We know his father was English with Dutch heritage, I think, hence the name Langelaan. Spent his childhood in France, spent his childhood in English. We get the impression he was perfectly bilingual. He was a writer. We know he was a journalist. Before the Second World War, he apparently spent time covering the Spanish Civil War for the New York Times. We know he was involved in active service for the Allies in World War II. We'll come back to that. We know he was imprisoned by the Nazis at one point. We know he escaped. After the war, he returned to writing fiction, journalism, but work that was fueled by his wartime experiences. In 1957, he wrote a story in French, La Mouche. This was quickly picked up by US Playboy, translated as The Fly, which has in turn become one of the most notorious weird sci-fi stories of the 20th century. If you're likely to have read anything at all by George Langelaan, you might have read The Fly. It's been anthologized, it's been republished, it has been, of course, made into 2 films. The first of those was in 1958. Written by James Clavell, directed by Kurt Neumann, starring, of course, Vincent Price. The second, arguably more well-known today, the 1986 version of The Fly, released 40 years ago this year, directed, of course, by David Cronenberg, starring Jeff Goldblum and Gina Davis. We'll come back to the Cronenberg, and I want to spend a little bit of time thinking about that. Langelaan wrote other things. He, after the war, after The Fly gave him a certain amount of success, he became associated with Planète magazine. Planète magazine, of course, the French magazine established by Louis Pavels and Jacques Bergier after the success of Morning of the Magicians. Langelaan wrote a pile of, I think, 8 pulpy spy novels in French. He was an editor too at the Robert Laffont publishing house and was known for his expertise and interest in spies and spying, informed by his war experiences. He became a talking head in French media in the 60s. He was the spy guy. Also spent time pursuing his interest in ghosts and apparently spent 30 years as a ghost hunter. Anecdotally, he has said that he was a very poor ghost hunter because in those 30 years, he never once actually managed to see or successfully hunt a ghost. That didn't stop him writing about it. In 1971, he published 13 Fantômes, a book of ghost hunting anecdotes and ghost stories from around the world. His significant publications, though, are the ones that I'm interested in. And they really include a book that was published in 1962, a collection of short stories published as Nouvelles d'Antimonde. This was published in 62, reissued in 1966, and then again, fairly recently in 2018, it's a collection of 13 stories, 13 weird French stories. The collection was translated into English. It came out as Out of Time in 1964, using 10 of the 13 original stories. Now, translation is always problematic with Langelaan. Now, we know that the stories were originally written in French, but we don't know who translated them. We don't know who translated the story that appeared in Playboy, the original version of The Fly, for example, which I think has led a lot of people to assume that Langelaan wrote in English. As far as I can see, he wrote in French. Now, we don't know who translated him. We don't know whether he translated himself from French into English, which would seem strange to me, but stranger things have happened, and that wouldn't surprise me with Langelaan. But it appears like there's a hidden history of translation when it comes to Langelaan. As well as that volume, Nouvelles de l'Antimonde, there's also 2 volumes of his war memoirs that were published together in a beautiful 1963 edition by the French group, the Club des Amis du Livre. And one of those volumes was called Un nommé Langdon, the second Le Masque d'un agent secret, published in English as Memoirs of a Secret Agent, in the US as The Masks of War, in the UK as the beautifully titled Knights of the Floating Silk. Now, why am I so interested? Why am I starting with Langelaan's war memoirs when it's the weird stories that I'm really primarily interested in here? I think it's worth doing because there's one particularly revealing moment that is deeply revealing that we find in these war memorials, in these war memoirs, about the kind of writer, possibly even the kind of man that George Langelaan was. So we know he was a writer, a storyteller, and I've mentioned he was associated with a fantastic realism of the Morning of the Magicians crowd and their Planet magazine. So we should be on guard when we're reading him. And there's a wonderful anecdote that's printed in the pages of Planet. It was printed in November, December 1964 and attributed to Langelaan that I'd like to briefly mention. And in doing so, I'm indebted to the writers of the now defunct Streatham and Brixton chess blog for pointing me in this direction. Langelaan was a committed chess player, particularly before the Second World War, and was a member reportedly of the Paris British Chess Club, which would meet once or twice a week at the Café du Grand Palais in Paris. Now, Langelaan told Planet in 1964 that one of the members of his team for a chess tournament on one occasion was none other than the great beast himself, uber magician and notorious rabble-rouser Alistair Crowley, the self-proclaimed wickedest man in the world. So Langelaan's legend goes, during a tournament, Crowley was pitted against none other than the Polish chess legend Savilie Tarkatawa. Crowley was losing and excused himself for a toilet break. Langelaan reportedly ran into Crowley in the bathroom where the great beast was standing in front of a mirror, sleeves undone, shirt and tie in disarray, performing strange hand gestures and mumbling strange incantations. Now, according to Langelaan, when Crowley saw Langelaan, he started laughing and said that he had just been, quote, in conference with the Baron. We don't know who or what this Baron was. Now, of course, Crowley returned to his game, and very shortly afterwards, Tartakower made a stupid mistake, toppled his king to resign, and thus handed the game to Crowley. Now, this is a corker of an anecdote, but the Streatham and Brixton chess blog is dubious, and I join them in their concern. Firstly, they wonder whether Crowley was, in fact, in Paris at the moment George Langelaan claimed that he was. Secondly, knowing more about chess than I do, they question whether Tartakower would have been involved with this type of low-level chess game in a pub, or a cafe rather, of the sort organised by the British Paris Chess Club at this point when he was a global chess celebrity. So it certainly seems then that, as great as this anecdote is, that Langelaan might well be making use of the fantastic realism approach, playing fast and loose with the truth here. Now, I wanted to mention this anecdote because it sets the scene for how Langelaan describes his experiences. And it shows us that when we're dealing with his war memoir, we really got to be on our guard. You know, on one hand, it looks like Langelaan, let's not discredit him, had a distinguished and eventful wartime career. He spent the early war years in northern France before being evacuated early at Dunkirk in 1940. He returned to France as part of the Special Operations Executive, parachuted behind enemy lines apparently in 1941. He was to work with the French resistance, passing intelligence back to the Allies, but was captured and imprisoned, eventually escaping, making his way back to England through Spain. Apparently, too, he spent the latter part of the war in North Africa and then was part of the early troops involved in the liberation of Paris. So if you're one for war memoirs, I'm generally not, then there's much that is interesting in that kind of anecdote. Now, but what I'm most interested in is what Langelaan tells us about his entry into the Special Operations Executive on his return from France. And we think the Crowley anecdote was a corker. This is up there. And all of this is narrated with humour. All of this is narrated very, very lightly. Not only does Langelaan tell us how he was trained to be part of the Special Operations Executive, how he was trained to kill with his bare hands, which apparently later in life he had to do twice, but he was offered and accepted facial reconstruction surgery before being sent back out to France. According to Langelaan, this was because there were fears that his spying could be compromised in France if he was recognised. So, and it's there in the memoir, his ears were reshaped, his nose was too, and his chin was rebuilt. All of this is described very breezily, very jokily by Langelaan in his memoir. He says that he feels he's an ugly man and wants to be as good looking as Gary Cooper after the operation. And my first impression was incredulity. I'm like, come on, Langelaan, this couldn't have happened. It seems too James Bond to be plausible. And things weren't helped by the before and after pictures included in the book. And I'll try and put these in the show notes together on the website. But they look pretty ridiculous. Like, as far as I'm concerned, with the greatest of respect, if facial reconstruction surgery has happened, you want to be sacking your surgeon because you want to be at least looking different after the operation has happened. So nothing has really changed apart from a comb over and a ridiculous bushy moustache as far as I'm concerned. So I was completely prepared in thinking about this podcast to be describing Langelaan as a fabulist, to be calling BS on his war stories here. And then thinking about his fiction from that perspective, as I have been with the Crowley anecdote. But then I can just about accept facial reconstruction surgery in the Second World War for injured and mutilated soldiers, but not as a form of kind of advanced disguise. But then I did a little research into the matter. And there was, in fact, an article that was published in The Lancet by a researcher, Roderick Bailey, not about Langelaan, but about how indeed there are cases of soldiers being medically transfigured through surgery, members of Langelaan's Special Operations Executive, right in the middle of World War II in the 1940s. And the details of this do seem very, very similar, and the types of operations that happened do seem to dovetail very, very closely with what Langelaan actually says in his memoir. So maybe we should take all of this stuff with a pinch of salt, but I feel a lot more solid in kind of really thinking about this perspective and thinking about how Langelaan's weird fiction written after the war, after this facial reconstruction surgery, and think about how this might be a kind of fundamental starting point for reading and understanding his fiction. You couldn't make it up. There is, in fact, a fly loose in the room from where I'm talking to you at the moment. As we say in South Wales, it is doing my head in. Don't be alarmed if I suddenly start swishing and swaying and getting violent. Maybe I'll stop mutating, and maybe you'll be witness to the first podcasting fly transformation. It would be exceedingly appropriate. I don't know. The moment is right, however, for us to start thinking about Langelaan's fiction. And I want to start with The Fly. I'd say that amongst the short stories in Nouvelles de l'Antimonde, I'd say there are 4 or 5 in there that, aside of The Fly, that are really worth checking out. Really vibrant and interesting examples of the genre that really haven't found their way into the English-speaking world. And that's part of the reason why I'm recording this episode. I think it's certainly worth digging out a copy of The Fly if you haven't read it. As I mentioned before, it is something that has been anthologized many times. Most recently, I think, in the British Library Tales of the Weird series, there's a volume called Promethean Horrors. It's in there. It's also something you'll be able to find online fairly easily in French and English. Also, probably, like most of Langelaan's work, it's possibly overdue a contemporary translation, perhaps, as well. But it's really interesting to think about how the 1986 adaptation of the film by David Cronenberg sits in relation to the original story. It's likely that you might have seen the film if you haven't read the story. And I think we're right to talk about adaptation. Originally, when I started thinking about this, I'd sort of toyed with the idea that maybe the Cronenberg film was a remake of the earlier 1950s adaptation. But no, this is an adaptation of Langelaan's story. And it explicitly says so right at the start of Cronenberg's film. But I think what Cronenberg has taken from Langelaan is the essential idea, the essential concept, rather than the narrative. So the central idea of Cronenberg's and Langelaan's workings is that you have a brilliant scientist who is nearing perfection with a dematerialization, rematerialization, essentially teleportation device. But our scientist is a man. He's a little impatient. He ends up experimenting on himself in both versions of the story. And when he's doing that, a housefly sneaks into the teleportation chamber to damaging and, of course, nightmarish effect. Cronenberg is different in that the story he builds contains a romance at the heart of it. Gina Davis is science journalist, is looking for a story, finds one, falls in love, and becomes pregnant along the way. Everything is ruined, of course, by the hubris of Jeff Goldblum's scientist. Langelaan's version of The Fly is constructed as a what happened mystery story. We follow the scientist's brother-in-law as he attempts to work out precisely why his wife has been arrested for the gruesome murder of her scientist husband. He's a scientist who has been involved in an experiment gone wrong. For Cronenberg, And when we're watching Cronenberg's Fly, we know what happens. We follow Goldblum's transformation. It's all of its gross body horror detail. Langelaan's version sees this hinted at. We never really know the true horror until the end of the story, until a gruesome revelation. It's more of a noirish, surprise-ending crime thriller than the unveiling of the whole horror as it happens that we see in Cronenberg's version. But I also think context is super important in different ways to both stories. Cronenberg's genius is to invest the fly with sex, sexual desire, and what Goldblum's scientist describes early on as the special lusty quality of flesh, of the human body. And flesh in its erotic potential is, of course, a preoccupation of David Cronenberg's work, as anyone who's seen the majestic Videodrome can testify. But I think there's this interesting juxtaposition of the body, what happens to it and what might happen to it, a becoming insect in the context of Cronenberg's 1980s, in the context of developments in technology and media and television, video, publicity, publishing. That's absent from Langelaan's story. That's absent from the version that came out 30 years earlier. There's no romance in there. There's no sex in there. But what you have got, and what makes it a completely different event, is you've got the proximity to the war. So firstly, of course, Second World War ending with the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and the ambient anxieties in the 1950s about the potential for harm, for mutation, for change at a quantum level caused by the use of nuclear, of atomic energy, of atomic weapons as well. But I also think there's potential for us to think about the role played by Langelaan's own war stories here. I think there's a way of reading The Fly that reads the idea of a mutated human as some kind of reworking or a thinking through as a France occupied by Nazis, right? So there's that kind of psychosocial level of a way into Langelaan's Fly. And throughout his stories too, Langelaan also shows a preoccupation with the body, with the physical form, its changing, its modification. There are also instances throughout Langelaan's stories that Langelaan's narrators are concerned about their height or how they shape up in appearances to other people. So there is this modification, this kind of body envy, jealousy that feels caught up in some way with the facial reconstruction surgery that Langelaan might well have undergone during the war. This idea of becoming something else, of transforming into something different. There's also another context to Cronenberg's film, how it speaks to contemporary 1980s debates on birth control and abortion. Now, this isn't something I can claim to be an expert on, but it's my understanding that abortion in Canada was only decriminalized in 1988. So a film released in 1986, and with the horror of Gina Davis's character made pregnant by a human mutant fly carrying a human mutant fly baby, clearly speaks to some kind of ambient ongoing debate and anxieties that were clearly in the air at this point. It is not for nothing that Cronenberg himself appears in the film as a crazed gynecologist in a horrific dream sequence. That's, of course, all absent from the Langelaan. But I think what we have much more cleanly and clearly in his original short story is a distinction between man and fly, between man and non-human other. Cronenberg's all about blurring and the fusing of boundaries. And this kind of fusion doesn't take place in quite the same way in the original story. The human transforms, but the fly remains a distinct identity. And actually, one of the subplots of the short story is the hunt for the fly that needs to be recaptured in order to give the scientist any chance of transformation back to his original state. Spoiler, they don't find it. So there is a separation between man and fly. And maybe Langelaan allows us to think a little bit more cleanly about the borders between insect and human in a way that Cronenberg's film doesn't do that. And for that reason, I think it's really nice to think about the fly as a really kind of solid and perhaps overlooked example, a literary example of or that sits in the great tradition of literary doubling. I'm thinking about, of course, Oscar Wilde's Picture of Dorian Gray. I'm thinking about Robert Louis Stevenson's Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And of course, I'm thinking about Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. And I think we should really be thinking about George Langelaan's The Fly as being part of that canon. That then is The Fly. But what of Langelaan's other weird stories? As I mentioned, these can be tricky to get hold of in English. Out of Time hasn't been republished. You can find it on secondhand websites for silly money. Occasionally, some of the stories will crop up in anthologies. But his Nouvelles de l'Antimonde was in fact reissued by the Arbre Vengeur publishing house in French in 2018. There is a very interesting introduction in the edition I have to that volume by Hubert Prolongeau, who refers to yet another colourful way of reading George Langelaan's stories. Yes, there is yet another controversial moment. Prolongeau mentions the claims made by a researcher by the name of Alexandre Clément that George Langelaan didn't actually write these stories himself. Alexandre Clément argues, apparently, that Langelaan's fiction was, in fact, penned by a certain Frédéric Dard. Now, you might recognize that name. Dard is better known by his pen name San Antonio, one of the most influential and prolific names in French crime and mystery writing of the 1950s, 1960s. Prolongeau is, however, dismissive of Clément's claims, and I'm going to follow his lead, but I adore how this speculation that George Langelaan didn't write his own stories adds yet another grain of oddness to this already weird persona of Langelaan. Lest we forget, he's a soldier, a spy, facially reconfigured, he's a chess player, possible chum of Alistair Crowley, and now questions are asked about whether he wrote his own stories. This all seems at least as weird as anything that appears in his fiction. So the anthology that I'm referring to, Nouvelles de l'Antimonde, contains 13 stories, including The Fly. And I think, as I mentioned, there are maybe 4 or 5 stories that really kind of warrant our attention today. Many of them seem to be marked by an authorial discomfort with his own body. There's also frequently a mistrust of women. There's frequently a real fondness for animals. I found myself thinking sometimes of Robert Aikman's uneasy domesticities in his English language weird stories. And I also find Langelaan's stories very cruel. The protagonist doesn't always come across well at the end of his stories. He seems to be punished. There seems to be a moral element in many of his tales. And to this end, I found myself also reminded of Patricia Highsmith's short stories, particularly her short animal story. We've spoken about The Fly, but I first discovered Langelaan through another story here, Recession, or Recession. I discovered that story through the French writer Emmanuel Carrère, who writes about it in his novel/memoir, Yoga. One of the very few contemporary writers to have written about Langelaan, as it happens. And Carrère writes reasonably extensively in that book about his youthful reminiscences of having read George Langelaan's Nouvelles de l'Antimonde. And it's really kind of interesting to see how a contemporary writer is revisiting this forgotten book. What he remembers, what Carrère remembers particularly, is this story, Recession, which itself is very bizarre. It's very weird. It's a story which very strangely recounts a soul's voyage from death through purgatory to rebirth. So we follow the internal consciousness, the internal monologue of an old man from moments before, through, during, after death, through the boredom of purgatory when he's left with just his own thoughts and imagination, to rebirth as a young child. It's an oddly compelling narrative. It's an oddly compelling subject. And Carrère is interested in the Buddhist notion of bardo and says that this story is the best literary example that he is aware of it. Now, as far as I know, Langelaan was never really deeply engaged with Eastern philosophies. I also liked a story called La Dame d'Outre Nulle Part, The Woman from Nowhere. This is a story about a scientist. Again, a scientist, we see a lot of them in Langelaan, a scientist who lives alone, watches TV late at night. Of course, we need to remember this is the 1950s. TV was down to 2 channels, wasn't on 24 hours a day. So there was a moment when televisions were showing nothing. You could put them on and there'd be no signal. And our scientist, because he hasn't got anything better to do, ends up watching television after the broadcasting has stopped for the day. And all of a sudden, he starts to realize that his television is picking up a strange signal. What's more, this strange signal appears to be from a group of Japanese scientists who can see through his TV screen and see him. So these kind of faltering conversations eventually give way to a conversations with a young woman who appears on our scientist's TV screen, who thankfully understands English, and perhaps inevitably the pair of them fall in love. And I like this one. It deals with, oddly, many of the same anxieties that motivate The Fly, but in a different way. So what might be the other unanticipated side effects of our nuclear age? We find out that these scientists have all been transmitted to another realm after the atomic bomb. But also the kind of power of the pervasive power of the burgeoning medium of television in the 1950s and 1960s too. This whole story really has a feel of a Twilight Zone episode to me. And it was adapted for French TV in 1967. I'm eager to see it. Another story I like less, actually, La Miracle, the Miracle, a story about a man who pretends to have become a paraplegic after a train crash, but is caught out, was actually filmed in the US as part of the Alfred Hitchcock Presents series. But it resonates with that kind of vibe. It resonates also with some of Roald Dahl's Tales of the Unexpected. One of the most anthologized stories in this collection is L'autre main, The Other Hand. That is also included in a recent British Library Tales of the Weird anthology edited by Mike Ashley about weird fiction in French, Danse Macabre. This is a weird but relatively predictable story about a character who starts to feel that his hand is no longer his own and accidentally on purpose falls into a carpenter's buzzsaw in a gruesome way of kind of addressing the problem. This actually kind of starts to recall The Fly, the idea that your body isn't belonging to you. But I actually found, again, myself thinking about Langelaan's war memoirs at this point. When I was reading L'Autre Main, apparently as part of his special operations spy training, as well as being trained to kill people and rabid dogs with his bare hands, Langelaan was also trained as a counterfeiter. And there are interesting passages in L'Autre Main about how the victim's hand starts to adopt writing that isn't his own. I'm fascinated by how maybe these war stories, these war experiences come through into these stories in different ways. But there are another two stories that I really like, neither of which are particularly original, but both of them have a certain concept or a certain moment that I find really engaging and really compelling. One of these, which didn't make it to the English translation of the volume, is Thinking Robots, or Robots Pensants, when the narrator fantastically gets into a game of cat and mouse with a character who, it turns out, is based on or is the Comte de Saint-Germain. Now, the Comte de Saint-Germain is one of the most mythologized figures from the French weird imagination. He has elements of him that are drawn from reality, but when and for how long he existed and what, if any, were the nature of his magical powers have led to much speculation. And he's a figure that French weird will come back to. But in this story, in Robots Pensants, Langelaan builds on his chess knowledge, on his chess expertise. The narrator has lost a good friend of his and suspects that he has been kidnapped by the Comte de Saint-Germain and used to power mysterious and macabre chess-playing robots. It's a little overlong, but it's great fun. There's lots of autonomous machines and the question about how much agency do these machines have? Should we be letting these machines think for us? Should we be letting them play chess for us? It's kind of fascinating and I think quite interesting at this moment in our history when we risk delegating everything to AI. I enjoyed the trip to the Comte de Saint-Germain's workshop, which is located on the edge of the lake at Enghien-les-Bains, just opposite the casino. But for me, maybe Langelaan's stories in this volume get most exciting and most interesting in a story called Temps mort, Dead Time. This is another scientific experiment, but one that deals with the notion of slowing down time. There is a wonderful passage in this story, and I'll let you uncover it, but it's a long passage where, in preparations for being put into suspended states of reality, which reminded me a little bit of the kind of long sleeps that the characters in Stanley Kubrick's 2001 and in Alien go into. We have a character that is put into a state where he realizes that he is forced to live very, very quickly, whereas the people around him are actually, relative to that, forced to live very, very slowly. So for him, what feels like hours, days even, only feels like seconds for those people around him. And again, we have a concept. Again, we have this notion of kind of time as horror. And there's a wonderful quote that I'd like to read from Out of Time, the English translation of Langelaan's stories. Time, for me, is one of the best elements of horror. Not only because we know so little about it, because it is nothing and everything. We have so far only measured it in a miserable sort of way, cutting up minute fractions of it into days and hours that seem endless to youth and so short for elderly people. But we are beginning to discover that time is something more than real. something tangible and even solid. In it, scientists can already begin to feel the past and the future. In time and space, they are discovering time cells, or time in time. For the insect that lives a few minutes, we are eternal. But for a range of mountains, we flit about so rapidly that we do not really exist. Everything that has ever happened and everything that will happen is in that one single blob of time. That is real horror. Outside with a cup of coffee for no special reason other than it's quite nice being outside. And honestly, because of the time of year and because of the weather, I have actually been annoyed by a number of actual real flies during the recording of this podcast. I think, though, it's interesting that in his tale of Becoming Insect, George Langelaan never really encourages us to like flies. They always, remain this insurmountable other. The same is true of Cronenberg's version of the story too. I've enjoyed getting to know the life and works of George Langelaan a little bit, and it does seem like there's more work to be done there. Not only does his super fascinating and not a little nuts biography warrant unpacking, but I think there's also ways in which Langelaan can be served better by translation, and certainly by telling the stories of how his translation has come about. And maybe there are indeed people working on George Langelaan right now. I haven't been able to uncover them, and I'd love if anybody working on Langelaan could get in touch. I'd love to kind of continue that conversation. I promised at the start of this episode that I'd mention some of the feedback French Weird has had so far. I've been delighted that people have been discovering this podcast and listening to it. And please do follow it. Please do subscribe via Apple Podcast or Spotify if the mood takes you. Also, please do tell your friends and family to start listening as well. I'm not sure if I'm going to have a regular postbag section, but we shall see about that. I did want to mention a couple of pieces of correspondence that I've had so far, though. There have been a couple of mentions of the music, and clearly this music is not for everyone. It has been composed and performed by me with a MIDI keyboard that I've had for a few years and have never really put to any service. So I'm wedded to it at the moment. The other alternative is for me to get my guitar out, and that's really not something that needs to be inflicted on the world. I was delighted to hear from George, who got in touch, encouraging me to think about Victor Segalen. Segalen is a modernist writer, explorer, fascinating figure, somebody I've never really spent much time thinking about. I'm aware of his work on Arthur Rimbaud, but it kind of stops there. So absolutely, George, thank you for that. I will find the time to spend a bit of time there, and we'll see where that ends up. Thanks too to Maria for her lovely words and for encouraging me to think about Parisian cemeteries. Absolutely, I really want to take this podcast away from just the literary, and it needs to be more active with me going out there as well, and that's certainly the next step. Me coming into the garden is the first step of that. Jeremy, thank you. Jeremy has very generously suggested that I think about musique concrète. Yeah, we need to get a bit more music in the podcast. We need to kind of really embrace French music. That's something that I'm keen on doing. And thanks to David as well for suggesting Mylène Farmer. We absolutely need to unpack Mylène's weirdness here. That's all from me now. I hope you've enjoyed today. I hope you've enjoyed thinking about flies. I hope you've enjoyed thinking about George Langelaan, and I hope maybe I've introduced a new name to your understanding, to your kind of literary repertoire. Be careful out there. Watch out for flies. And this has been French Weird.